So, the discussion around how Jonah should be classified is a quagmire where many have ventured and few have returned. So, of course, that means discussing it online is the correct place, as there's nothing but nuanced conversations here on the web. And as we get started, remember that this examination hopes to help show what kind of considerations go into determining the genre of a passage. Essentially, this is just one giant example. I also feel like I need to share that even as I state my conclusions on Jonah's genre, I'm human. This is my opinion. It's not fact. Honestly, it is not faith-shattering to me if Jonah is completely fictional, as the message of the story is still powerful. I guess what I'm trying to say is we should often hold loosely to our conclusions on things that we cannot definitively declare. And with that said, let's ask the question, is Jonah fictional? Well, several suggested solutions to the issue of Jonah's genre begins with the assumption of Jonah as a fictional tale. And this is because, as T.D. Alexander puts it, the historical improbability of the events narrated in Jonah is frequently voiced as a strong argument for the fictitious nature of the entire book. Another reason presented for Jonah being fictional is the didactic nature of the narrative. Therefore, the genres that are suggested define their narratives as fictional. These categories include parable, allegory, or parody. Parable. A certain man was. Robert Farrar gives a simplified definition of parable as simply a comparison, a putting of one thing beside another to make a point. A parable is an extended analogy with the purpose of persuading the audience, and this is easily seen in the teachings of Jesus and how he used parables. For example, Jesus starts a parable in Matthew 13:24 with, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." Or in Mark 4:30 when he says, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use to describe it?" What is sometimes overlooked is the way the Old Testament influenced Jesus' use of parables. Klein Snodgrass demonstrates that parables in the Old Testament are a tool of prophets in the conflict they have with Israel and her leaders. While some scholars disagree on exactly which passages in the Old Testament should be considered parables, Klein Snodgrass identifies 12 passages that appear related to the parables that Jesus used. But is Jonah a parable? Is Jonah a prophetic narrative that seeks to compare Israel and her leaders in a way that shows something is wrong with their hearts? In a way, yes. But ultimately, I would argue no. Since parables are so widely used in the Bible, many have started to look for the common generic markers that help identify them. One example of this is a phrase like, "a certain man was," as the prologue to the narrative in question. This line, or some kind of version of it, is seen with such ubiquity within parables that Craig Bloomberg states that it seems to correspond to the modern "once upon a time." Just as people today recognize such a phrase as the opening of a fairy tale, so Jesus' audience would have been prepared by the start of a parable to recognize it as a fictitious narrative. Jonah's introduction, however, does not follow this trope. Instead, Jonah begins very similar to other prophetic books, like Jeremiah, which starts with the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests living in Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him. In addition to a typical opening line or phrase, often parables have details that are more symbolic than literal. Some argue that the meaning of Jonah's name sets him up to be a stand-in for Israel. Others, like David Downs, connect Jonah being swallowed by the fish to represent Israel's exile by referencing Jeremiah 51:34. Jonah may be symbolic of Israel, but almost all parables have anonymous characters, meaning the fact that Jonah is named at all makes it not fit this convention. And beyond just having a name, Jonah is also a historical person who is mentioned in 2 Kings 14:25. Another consideration for Jonah not being a parable is its length. As Douglas Judish points out, a parable, too, as already noted, is by nature quite brief and simple. Jonah, while short relative to some other books of the Bible, still consists of 48 verses. The longest parable in the Bible is the parable of the prodigal son told by Jesus in Luke 15, verses 11 to 32, which is 21 verses long. Also, in every parable, the same style is kept throughout, whether it is prose or poetry. In Jonah, a reader will find both. And one last aspect to consider is that parables, especially in the Old Testament, are followed with a short explanation of the parable itself. After an unnamed prophet in disguise tells King Ahab about a fake prisoner he failed to guard, to which Ahab condemns the prophet reveals himself, pointing out how Ahab failed by releasing Ben-Hadad. Jonah, conversely, ends abruptly with an unanswered question. As Jack Sasson points out, the final verses do not function as interpretive keys in the ways that other conclusions to parables normally do. Therefore, it appears that Jonah does not have the typical markers to make it a parable, but there are other fictional genres to deliberate. Allegory. Symbols. Symbols everywhere. Stewart defines an allegory as a kind of extended analogy, sometimes including extended metaphors in which the meaning of the story is not to be found in the concepts and actions presented, but in concepts and actions outside the story to which the story points analogically. To which the story points analogically. Yeah, that works. Edwin Good points out that this was a typical view among scholars. This has led to speculation on the various elements of Jonah and what they could represent. Was the plant an allegory for Zerubbabel? Indeed, it could be, as Good states, that Jonah as a character represents all that the author of the book means to reject. Jonah also seems to be pulling from many parts of the Bible, as Sasson illustrates when he gives the following list. Jonah's sea narrative depends on Ezekiel 27. His prayer is a pastiche from Psalms. His involvement with Nineveh copies from the Elijah cycle, and his theological sentiments draw on Jeremiah and Joel. In fact, the entire story of Jonah could be viewed as an illustration of Jeremiah 18. In that chapter, Yahweh, through Jeremiah, confronts the Israelites who seem to want to be saved without changing their ways. Verses 7 and 8 especially stand out. At one moment I might announce concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will uproot, tear down, and destroy it. However, if that nation about which I have made the announcement turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the disaster I had planned to do to it. While there may be some elements of truth to Jonah being used to confront the Israelites and correct their view of how a nation should respond to God's call for repentance, allegory also does not fit Jonah. Stewart points out that for allegories to be effective, the symbols need to be understood by the readers right away. As Stewart shows, it would be an unusual allegory indeed that waited to the end, the 4th chapter in the case of Jonah, to reveal the point of its hero's actions. So this leaves one last genre to check out. Parody. Weird Al in ancient times. One element of Jonah that many have pointed out is its humor that is found throughout the story. Amy Erickson goes so far as to state that Jonah as a character is funny, read pathetic. John Miles details how humor in the Bible should be understood against the general tendency of ancient humor to laugh at rather than laugh with. Jonah's actions, which depict him as the least faithful prophet in the Bible, is why Miles puts forth that Jonah is a parody. Parody builds on many of the same principles as parable and allegories, like stereotypes and analogies. The details are chosen not because they are historical, but because they help show the absurdity of it all. As Miles points out, the characters in the narrative, the prophet himself, the summoning deity, the wicked king in his wicked city, are stock characters. The scenes, the prophet's initial reluctance, his predication of destruction, his grief at failure are stock scenes. While the use of tropes does not necessitate that Jonah is a parody, it does mean that Jonah meets the requirements for it to become a parody. Miles sees each chapter as parodying a specific form of Hebrew literature. The first chapter parodies prophetic tales. Even Youngblood, who sees Jonah as historical, does state that the way Jonah is written can be characterized as a gentle parody of the traditional prophetic account designed to challenge Judah's distorted notions of traditional prophetic themes such as divine justice and Israel's election. The second chapter, with its Thanksgiving psalm, is seen as a parody of Psalms through its use of exaggerated imagery. The third chapter is a parody of the stories of how typically the king rejects the prophet and his message. And finally, the fourth chapter is a parody of the stories of prophets who cry out to Yahweh in their distress and are comforted. It may appear that parody is the obvious choice. Nevertheless, there are issues with selecting it as the genre of Jonah. As you see, for parody to work, the few historical details we are given, like the name of the prophet and the city he is sent to, would need to be viewed as only existing to help people know that this is a book about a prophet and that the city is indeed a known evil city. As Miles puts it, the selection of Jonah as the prophet's name and Nineveh as the wicked city where he will preach may mean no more than the selection of Tex and Dodge City would mean to the parody of the Western movie. Would Jonah still work if any other prophet's name was inserted and any other city chosen? Possibly. But if the character of Jonah is just a parody of a prophet, well, why use a prophet who only appears in one verse in one other book? Parody also views Jonah as written simplistically, and yet, as Erickson points out, it quickly becomes apparent that the book is neither simple nor artless. Instead, it appears that the author of Jonah used some parody techniques in his effort to present what happened. So what? Even though Jonah does not fit into a fictional genre, it still must be shown that it was trying to depict events that are historical before it could be considered a historical narrative. This means next week, before we look at genres that would make room for Jonah to be seen as historical, we're going to see if history allows room for such an amazing tale to have actually happened. Again, ancient historical narratives were representation of events that the author actually believes to have happened, not accurate depictions. But it would be hard to argue that the writer of Jonah believed the events of Jonah happened if there was no possible way for them to have actually happened. For now, though, I hope this exploration through fictional narratives has helped you start to see the process it takes to accurately evaluate any passage or book. Understanding the common elements and rules of a genre will greatly elevate the difficulty of determining how to classify a narrative. This shows how the Bible was structured in a way to inform its readers of what it was trying to say. If we can come to it with a proper historical and literary lens, we will find all kinds of treasures waiting for us. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this really in-depth look at Jonah and fictional genres. Stick around to see for next time to see, could Jonah have actually happened? If this was a blessing to you, please subscribe, please like, please ring the bell, do all the YouTube things, please leave a comment. Please share this with other people. If you would like to read this in blog form or listen to it in podcast form, I have links for those down below, and I will see you next time.